Hello and welcome to this FMB webinar. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Hayley, I work for the FMB, and I'm here today with Sophie Hooper and Sean Lundy, who are going to talk about managing competence in relation to the Building Safety Act in a moment. But first of all, just to go through some housekeeping notices for everybody. The timing for the session, the presentation will go on for something like 35, maybe 40 minutes. And then we'll have Q&A after that, so it'll be maximum an hour to get through everything that we need to cover this afternoon. After the session, we'll send everybody a follow-up email. That includes people who registered and haven't been able to make it. So you'll all get a follow-up email, which will also have a link to the recording of the session, so that if there's anything you miss as we go through it, you can catch up with that later on, and we'll attach presentations and any other resources that we might refer to during the session. We'll put those in the email for you as well. If any questions occur to you as we're going through the session, if you hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the little Q&A box. Just type them in there, and then when we get to the end, we'll address those for you as well. I do just want to say before I hand over to Sophie and Sean, though, that we're not covering all aspects of the Building Safety Act in this session. We're purely talking about managing competence in organisations. But if you do want to learn more about other aspects of the Building Safety Act, we have got a whole series of 5 webinars that are in the members area of the website that you might want to access. That covers everything you might possibly want to know. And we will be doing future events on things like the role of principal designers and principal contractors and how those two things interact with each other. So we're working on those behind the scenes at the moment. So you won't get every answer to every Building Safety Act related question in this session, purely about managing competence. So I think that's about all from me. So I'll now hand over first of all to Sophie to set some context for what we're going to talk about today. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you, Hayley, and I'll quickly introduce myself and also let Sean introduce himself. I am Sophie Hooper. I'm the Deputy CEO at APS, but for all intents and purposes for today, I'm also the chair of the Industry Task and Finish group on the management of competence in organisations. Aside from that, within APS, I lead on strategy, anything policy related, and stakeholder engagement, including with ICC, the Industry Competence Committee, and MHCLG, the relevant department. I've got some past stints working on other groups. I am a founding member of the Building Safety Alliance and provided the Secretariat for Working Group 8 on the competence framework for building safety managers. And as part of this work, I've also been co-opted on the Industry Competence Committee that is focused on the complementary piece of work. I think that's enough from me for now. Sean, perhaps you can say a few words.
Thanks, Sophie. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. So just by way of an introduction, I'm Sean Lundy. I'm a chartered health and safety or safety and health professional and a chartered building engineer. I'm also a board member on the Property Institute, and I have a day job as well. My day job is working and running a business called Tetra, who are a health, safety and fire consultancy working into the built environment. And very, very importantly for today, I'm also the technical author for the Industry Task and Finish group. So I'll be following on from Sophie, talking a little bit about some of those nuances around competence and talking about this guidance and how we're positioning it, and then answering any questions you have at the end of the session. So great to be here. Thanks, Sophie, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. And yes, thank you everyone for having us here today to talk about this most important subject. Now, my camera is there. I can see the slides on my other screen though. So if you see me looking around, please bear with me. So Sean, would you mind showing the first slide, please? Because obviously the reason why we're here today is because the tragic events that took place so many years ago in June 2017. And that picture of the Grenfell Tower is actually a really important reminder about why we need to comply with all of these new rules. and that's that we're all working together to provide safe, healthy, sustainable homes for people. And as I indicate, everyone in this virtual forum has got a role to play within that as contractors, principal contractors, etc. Now, you also see the pictures of the Building Safety Act and the building regulations. They are really driving forward some of the key principles that Dame Judith Hackett identified as big gaps in what was happening in the sector. Competence, accountability, enforcement, none of that was really taken forward in the way that it should have, which ultimately led to the tragic events that took place. And the Building Safety Act and the building regs in their iteration are, of course, really trying to embed those principles in the new regime. Now, the building regulations, important to remember, is that they are not just about HRB. Part 3 of the Building Safety Act and the building regs are applicable to all building regs. And that means that the requirements around competence and the management of competence in organizations really are applicable to everyone involved with building work. Now, what do we think is coming next? As you can see there on the slide, there are still investigations ongoing. There are a number of suspects that are under investigation. And Sean and I were discussing earlier that we are expecting prosecutions to take place in 2026. So this is really starting to feel like when people are not complying, there will be consequences, something that was missing from previous regimes. We also see that in things like the building regulator, the building safety regulator. It's got its new iteration that started yesterday, where they've become a standalone body and where they are really trying to strengthen their action across the board, not just HRB. They're really starting to look at standards across the piece, including competence. And to really focus back on the context for this particular webinar, competence and the expectations around competence, especially organizational competence, is something that hasn't really been set out as clearly as it has for individual competence. The last 7 years, 8 years, we've been talking about individual competence, but last year, the Industry Competence Committee, the statutory body responsible for driving up standards around competence, really started to look more at what organizations need to do in this particular area. And that really brings us then to what the purpose of the Industry Task and Finish Group is, because we're here to develop guidance on how to manage the competence in organizations, to provide that hands-on guidance to complement what the Industry Competence Committee is setting out in terms of what they expect from organizations. And the Industry Task and Finish Group, it's a task and finish group. It's a loose collaboration from across the sector. We've all come together and said we need to do something in this area because we're dealing with too many questions from our various members and stakeholders across the industry about how, as organizations, they can really step up in this area. And because the work was going on with the ICC, we knew it would be focusing on high-level principles. We wanted to make sure that we could come together so there was uniformity about what we thought good looked like in this area. The Industry Task and Finish Group has got 3 groups, 3 big stakeholder groups. We've got the full steering group, which are all of the decision makers of the organizations across the piece. CEOs, Hayley's also there. And they ultimately provide the final approval on this work that's going on. We then have a steering group, which are the technical experts from across the various sector, representing SMEs, large organizations across the board from various parts of the sector. And then last but not least, we've got a very experienced technical author, who you've already met, who is really doing all of the holding of the pen and taking account of all the feedback We did a consultation not too long ago in October. We've taken that feedback and we're now starting to work up and move towards that final document. I think in terms of the broader context of why we're here, I think I'll leave it there. Sean, over to you to delve into the detail of what we are doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, it's I mean, I've worked in the field of health and safety for over 25 years, and I've taught all levels really, and spoken to a lot of people who work into buildings. I chair a committee, an IOSH. IOSH is the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, construction committee, and we often get a lot of feedback around competence and the meaning of competence. So I thought it would be a good idea to talk about that. Of course, when we're thinking about, as Sophie's already said, the fact that the victims, those that tragically lost their lives and their families, and those affected by the Grenfell tragedy, they've been waiting an awful long time for those prosecutions. So that is going to begin this year, and I think that will change things a lot. And I think, as Sophie's already said, I think we will see more enforcement action around the Building Safety Act. So this 2026 really is a year of action, really, when we need to start really putting things into practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what competence is and this idea of being an intelligent customer, what we call the intelligent customer principle. Competence is a word that's used a lot. We see it in legislation and guidance, but actually it's not always been very well defined, and actually not very well implemented either. So we tend to focus very much on qualifications when we think about competence. When I speak to duty holders and how they assess competence, they're often looking at qualifications alone. I mean, I'm a very well qualified person myself. I've spent many years getting qualifications, but just by having a good qualification or a high level qualification, it doesn't automatically mean that I'm competent. So competence is a combination of things. It is not just the skills and knowledge that you have, but it's also the experience that you bring and gain over time, and very, very importantly and crucially, the behaviours that you exhibit within the work you do. That's a very interesting picture I've put on there. That actual picture is a real picture. It's not AI generated. I'm always accused of using AI generated pictures, but that was before the age of AI. So we tend to look at things, and we know perhaps when people aren't behaving in the right way, when they're maybe not following the rules or the procedures that they should be following, and perhaps even exposing themselves and others at risk. So it's this type of cultural shift that we really want to see within the built environment. There are two aspects really of building safety that I think we need to be mindful of. One of them is the important thing for health and safety, which is making sure that the people that do work, the people that actually get on and make buildings, work into buildings and construct buildings, that they all go home at the end of the day to their families and children and so on. That's a really important aspect of health and safety. But there is another dimension as well, which is the quality of the work that's done into buildings. And that's making sure that the buildings themselves don't create a legacy problem for the people that use the building and perhaps create ongoing risks. So we see both dimensions within buildings. Obviously, we want to make sure the workers are safe and healthy, but at the same time, we want to make sure those buildings are sustainable and safe for the future, and they don't leave a terrible legacy behind, which may lead to problems, certainly with fire safety and structural safety. Of course, fire safety and structural safety are the two main aspects of the Building Safety Act. That's the focus of those bits of legislation. There are obviously other things in buildings that we need to worry about: work at height, asbestos, perhaps, other risks as well, which aren't directly covered by the Building Safety Act, but nevertheless do present health and safety risks. So that combination, what we often refer to as SCEB, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, are what we need to look at when we sort of define competence, think about competence. The intelligent customer principle, well, that relates to that capability of an organization to select competent contractors and consultants who may be doing work on their behalf or behalf of a client. In the Grenfell inquiry, there have been lots of examples there where it can be seen that the management organisation at Grenfell wasn't an intelligent customer. In fact, the fire risk assessment that was selected by that organisation is cited as sort of making up their qualifications, passing themselves off as being more competent than they actually were. That's one thing, of course, so that's a clear ethical issue. And then the other thing, of course, is the procurement person that decided to use that contractor. They didn't know what they were looking at. So when they looked at their post nominals that they made up and looked at their CV, they didn't know really whether that person was competent or not, and they didn't know what those post nominals were. Nevertheless, they signed them off, and that person was able to go and do the risk assessment at Grenfell. Now, the risk assessment didn't cause Grenfell, but it's certainly one of the pieces of the puzzle, if you like, that demonstrates that the organisation wasn't capable of behaving as an intelligent customer, and it throws a spotlight on questions around competence of that particular area, in this case, fire risk assessment. And as Sophie said, Dame Judith Hackett, very keen to get to the bottom of this and say, well, look, the entire industry, regardless of what skill or trade you are, whether you're an architect, a builder, any tradesperson going into work into buildings, all have to demonstrate a degree of competence to do their work, not only do their work safely, but also not create those legacy issues that unfortunately we do see in buildings. So this is a very important point to make, that this is not only, of course, about individual competence, that's obviously very important, but it is also about organizational capability to behave as an intelligent customer. When we think about the drivers for competence, and Sophie's already alluded to some of this, there are lots of existing regulations and bits of legislation out there that already talk about competence. So it's not something new. And certainly within the world of health and safety, it's been a really important feature of most bits of legislation. What's shifted and changed a little bit is we've become a little bit more explicit in recent legislation, particularly in defining competence, certainly in fire safety and in the Building Safety Act, asking for organisations to demonstrate competence. When duty holders apply for what is known as a building assessment certificate for their higher risk buildings, the regulator does scrutinise competence of anybody who's been involved in doing work into that building. That could be people that do surveys, assessments, and inspections, and also contractors doing actual work in those buildings, focusing in very much on things like fire stopping, breaching compartmentation, or indeed not reaching those high standards when it comes to installing things like fire detection and alarm systems and so on. The focus of the Building Safety Act, of course, is not just fire, but also structure. So there's much more scrutiny now around structural safety in buildings and also materials that are being used in the buildings. We obviously, post Grenfell, we are concerned about combustible materials that are being used in buildings, and maybe sometimes the original design, deviations from the original design in terms of swapping out materials that were defined in the design for alternative materials, but finding those alternative materials don't meet the requirements of building regulations. So building regulations, of course, focuses very much on the client, but also the designers and the contractors working under those regulations. And there's a clear requirement for those entities to be competent. And then we move to the Grenfell inquiry. So the Grenfell inquiry, there were two parts to the Grenfell inquiry, phase one and phase two. Phase one concluded a few years ago, made a number of recommendations that the government committed to. Pretty much all of those recommendations were related to fire safety, and that led to the creation of a new piece of legislation called the Fire Safety England Regulations. They implemented all those recommendations apart from a requirement for personal emergency evacuation plans and vulnerable residents. That was seen to be a bit tricky to implement, but eventually it has come into regulation, and that is coming into force in April. But one of the important things from the Grenfell inquiry phase two recommendations, which concluded last year, was a real focus on competence. So very, very focused, of course, around fire risk assessors, following that revelation that the fire risk assessor at Grenfell was not competent. but also looking at all the professionals involved in construction. So from design, construction, through to refurbishment projects and the routine maintenance and management of buildings. They must all meet minimum competence standards, and that should be supported by training, but also certification and some self-evaluation of your own levels of competence. So a real call to industry to look at itself and reflect and say, are we competent to do the work we need to do, and how do we bring ourselves up to required levels? So that is being pushed forward, of course, through the work of the Industry Competence Committee, and the work that I'm doing with Sophie and colleagues on developing this competence management standard. So what we've been working on in the background is creating a guidance document. So the guidance document is organized in this way. You can see that it's broken into sections. It is a draft at the moment, so there will be a complete version hopefully published after March. Very important piece of work. And the idea, of course, is that the scope of this document will apply to all organizations across the built environment, very importantly with a proportionate approach. So the idea is you could be a very small company, a micro business, and you have that obligation to look at competence and make sure you're managing competence within the scope of your organization. But also you could be in a big organization, a tier one contractor, and you need to do the same. But of course, you can't apply the same standards, if you like, of management systems to a small organization as you would to a large organization. It's got to be a proportionate approach. However, the end game is to make sure people are competent. So the achievement of being competent doesn't change, but the systems you apply to it need to be scalable depending on the size of the organization. The Industry Competence Committee published 15 principles. I'll show you those in the next slide. And what we've done as the Industry Task and Finish Group is we've taken those and created some guidance around that. So the idea is to take those 15 principles and make them very practical and give you a sensible toolkit to be able to apply them in whatever organization you work in or work for. And to support this, we've developed some case studies, some templates to help with that process. So rather than sort of leaving that up to you to create those templates, the idea is to give you a head start, put the templates together, but also very importantly, the case studies as well. So you can sort of look at what good looks like within your particular area. So the message here really is that the guidance obviously links to the core legal requirements. So legal requirements often give you the what you need to do, but it very rarely tells you how to do it. So you obviously need guidance to give you the how, and this is what this piece of guidance is designed to do. But it's also designed to be very practical and very scalable. So it's a real challenge really to create one piece of guidance which is fit for all industry across the built environment. But nevertheless, that's what we're trying to do. These are the principles I mentioned. Won't go through all of these in detail, but the Industry Competence Committee is sort of put together a set of core principles. There are a lot of detail under each one of these principles, but it's pretty obvious stuff. There's obviously a requirement here to select and recruit staff that are competent, understand how to develop competence within the organization. How do you monitor competence, make sure people keep up to date? So that's around continuing professional development. So a lot of professional areas have CPD requirements built into their membership structures, but the requirement here probably is to think about doing professional development for all tradespeople and anyone working into the built environment. And then thinking about how you manage that process. So again, making sure that's very scalable. So large organizations may have more sophisticated management systems, but very small micro businesses don't need those sort of systems, but they still need a process to help them manage competence going forward. So when we implement those principles, again, this isn't an AI generated image. This is a real image that was taken by a colleague of mine, actually at a university, believe it or not. So basically, we need to make sure we give you practical guidance on how to implement those principles. So we provided a step-by-step structure. So purpose, practical actions that you can take, and then also some diagnostic questions that go with that. So these are just simple questions to ask yourself, can I just check myself off against them to check that I'm doing the right things? And again, those questions are designed to be scalable, to suit those very small businesses right up to those large businesses. We want to make sure we align to individual competency specifications. So in the next slide, I'll show you some examples of that, but there have been lots of a few published specifications, and we're expecting to see more as we go into the next years or so. There will be more specifications available which will define competence, some of them coming from trade associations, some through BSI and other organizations. We also want to emphasize leadership as well. So leadership, culture, and proportionality are key. Getting the right culture is really essential. I'll talk a bit more about that in one of my later slides. So these are some of the specifications that have been published over the last few years. You've got guidance documents there. These PAS documents, PAS stands for publicly available specifications. There's specifications that have been put together for principal designers, principal contractors, and there's a PAS there, 8673, for management of safety in residential buildings. So that's really focused on property managers and those that manage the buildings when they're in occupation. We do expect more guidance to be published, and probably these guidance documents, these specifications, to be updated over time. And we've seen other frameworks produced as well. So there is another British standard that's been produced for fire risk assessors, for example, following the call from the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 recommendations to create mandatory qualifications and potential regulation of that particular professional area. So we expect to see more of these published over time. Very important, of course, that you have a system whereby you can apply these competence specifications in a practical way. So that's exactly what the guidance is designed to do. If you read these specifications, they're often just a list of requirements, but it doesn't really give you a way of sort of implementing them. You need that guidance, and that's what the Task and Finish group has been attempting to do. I just wanted to talk a little bit also about some of the other schemes that are out there, the third-party certification schemes and other schemes. So third-party certification really is a formal independent review, if you like, of an organization against recognized standards. So UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, is the government, is the recognized body by government to do this. We also have what we call third-party schemes, organizations. This one is BAIF SP205, that go out and certificate companies as meeting those standards. So third party means that BAIF, if you like, is a UCAS accredited scheme, and they can apply third party certification to individual organizations to show that they've met those standards. It isn't the end of the process, of course, so it only gives you a very high level sort of review of an organization, but a lot of these schemes are providing assurance now for various services, particularly around things like fire stopping, fire doors, and fire risk assessments. You can become an asbestos accredited surveying company. In fact, the company I work for, Tetra, have that accreditation, and also for Legionella as well, water risk assessments into buildings. So there's lots of third-party certification schemes available, and these are becoming more sought after as well to provide clients with assurance. So it's worth remembering that the bar is being raised here. Although these schemes aren't often mandated, there is a higher an expectation that organizations will seek to achieve third-party certification where it is available. Of course, it isn't available in every circumstance. And then the other thing that you may have come across are the safety schemes in procurement. So some of these badges here you'll be familiar with, Achilles and Chaz and Safe Contractor. These provide a mechanism to do really what is a desktop exercise to measure off an organization against certain requirements. So normally a core set of health and safety criteria, typically covering things like health and safety policy, risk assessments, accident reporting. The idea, of course, is that you kind of jump through this hoop that gives the client some assurance that you've met a base standard around some of those systems. But there are limitations there. Rather like third-party certification schemes, it doesn't guarantee competence. So the way to view these schemes is they are definitely a starting point, not an end point. You start here, it gives a level of assurance, but there's still a requirement, if you like, to think about competence in terms of skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviors, and to think about how to manage that as you go on through the process. So starting point, not an end point, I think is what I'd say about these schemes. But I would expect these schemes, safety schemes of procurement and third-party certification schemes operated by UCAS accreditation to become more dominant actually in the built environment, particularly around high-risk buildings, of course, under the Building Safety Act. But again, it's not the sole answer to everything. So just a couple of slides to finish here about how what this might look like in a practical sense, and then we're finished and have some time for questions as well. So competence management in practice is just an example. So we frame this around a systems approach. This is the plan, do, check, act cycle. So if you've ever had any exposure to management systems, you'd be familiar with plan, do, check, act. However, it is a very simple approach that can be applied even in very small businesses. I think it's a good operating model for small businesses. So in this case, this is a small contractor, maybe doing work into a refurbishment project, sort of mixed use with commercial bits and flats, and they're doing structural work, fire protection, maybe electrics as well. So what do they do around the plan, do, check, act cycle? Well, the plan bit really is to identify where there might be high risk trades and set simple skills, knowledge, experience, and behavior competence criteria, of course. So that might include qualifications. It may include just checking that they've had experience of working to high risk buildings. And obviously they've got the skills to do the work that you're being asked to do. The behaviors bit is a bit more difficult, but of course you would expect people to exhibit positive cultural behaviors in any project, really. And that means letting you know if anything's changing or going wrong and speaking up. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. The do bit, of course, may involve actual checking qualifications. So making sure you've got evidence of that. Just discussing experience. So that could just be a conversation, perhaps. And also looking at any accreditations they may have. Maybe they're a member of one of the safety schemes in procurement that I mentioned earlier, or in fact, maybe they're accredited using a third-party certification scheme. And then think about inductions as well. So talking about how the work should be done. The check bit, really, well, this is how do you measure performance? So that could be done in various ways. Could be inspections, could be making sure there's photocritical work. In fact, in high risk buildings now, it is expected that there will be photographic evidence of critical work that's done on high risk buildings, and that should be stored in the golden thread of information, and then responding positively to any building control feedback. And in high risk buildings, of course, the Building Control Authority is the building safety regulator. And then acting is kind of that closing the loop a bit, which is, how do we respond to anything that's revealed during the check cycle? Maybe we want to issue some checklists, and in the guidance we've issued some diagnostic questions which can help with that process, and then maybe keep a record of preferred competent contractors or subcontractors for future use, and then the cycle goes round and round. So it's a continual review cycle, and hopefully the positive results of that would be a reduction in incidents or no incidents. First time sign off, so we're getting it right first time, fewer defects, fewer reworks, which often take time and cost money, and embedding competence and the competence process as standard practice rather than something new. So everyone just expects it to happen and it becomes part of the general culture. So that's obviously the ideal world. Not everything works in the ideal world. So, but that's kind of the goal, really, is to have this simple process which focuses on competence and make sure we're doing the right thing. But crucially, we can demonstrate we're doing the right thing as well. Within the guidance itself, we've given some examples. So this is just an example of a table from the guidance which follows a number of steps. So this is a 6-step process, thinking about how you identify relevant competence frameworks, how you select competent people to do the work, and then perhaps how you contextualize that around different building types as well. So obviously, higher risk buildings can vary quite a lot. So making sure you've got the right people working into the right building with the right experience, and then evaluating people against the competencies that you decide you need to use, and then developing learning and supervision, mentoring, if you like, to address any gaps, and then reviewing that whole process. So the outcomes there are fairly obvious, but I think one of the key outcomes is to support that continuous improvement and professional development at all levels, really. So even at a fairly rudimentary trade level, we can still expect people to develop in terms of their competence, and we should still have systems which help mentor them and help them progress and develop their learning in the process that we're putting together. And then just finally on that point, I wanted to talk a little bit about setting the right culture. So there's a phrase that's used a lot in health and safety called psychological safety and competence. Now, in the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2, the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 recommendations, some of those things are related to improving culture and behaviours around competence. And some of the evidence that was provided demonstrated a really damning culture certainly within the management company. So the person that did the procurement of that risk assessor, for example, they may have had concerns, but they didn't feel that they could speak up and raise those concerns. There were issues being raised by residents that were going through to the management company, and those issues weren't being discussed, and there was a blame culture. So it's basically a finger pointing exercise rather than people saying let's get this right. And certainly within the construction phase, so people working into that building, doing that refurbishment work, there were issues and concerns that were they were raised but not being listened to, or worse still, people had concerns but they didn't feel that they were in a safe environment to raise those concerns. So that's what psychological safety is all about. It's about feeling that you're in a safe environment, that you're comfortable, perhaps admitting mistakes, you're willing to learn when things go wrong and correct those mistakes. Things get shared with people, and that leads to more innovation and better decisions. Of course, I think we all know if we're in a psychologically unsafe environment, and we know when we might feel uncomfortable raising issues, certainly with managers and senior staff. It is incumbent on people who lead organizations to create the right culture. So a psychologically safe culture will lead to better competence outcomes. And I think the two things are very strongly connected. So we've talked a little bit about this, about leadership, about setting the right culture, and about how that links to competence in the guidance. And it was something that Dame Judith Hackett in her review was very keen to address certainly in the construction industry. And it's something I talk a lot about to my construction colleagues on the construction committee, how we kind of create that safer space where people can develop and learn and not fear admitting when things aren't quite right. So this is my final slide. So just a bit on the post-consultation work. So from the work we've done, we are engaging with the Industry Competence Committee to get their feedback. We are currently working on an updated version of the guidance. So it went out for consultation last year. We got some really excellent feedback, and we've taken that feedback on board. Some of that feedback was about not over-engineering the process. So we wanted to make sure that we got that feedback from people that work in slightly smaller organizations, just to see how they'd feel about implementing the guidance. They didn't feel overwhelmed. And the ask really was to create case studies and context which would make it work for those smaller organizations, the micro businesses and the SMEs that are out there, to make sure we weren't simply writing guidance that was only suitable for those big, large contracting organizations. So we've taken all that on board and we are working on that. And I can certainly tell you that that's something that's progressing well. We're hoping to have a final draft for sign off in the near future. And there is a possibility that we will develop a standard through the British Standards Institution, BSI, which will have broad reach throughout industry. So it's a really exciting piece of work. I think it's really necessary. Competence is a difficult nut to crack. As I said, I've been working in this industry for many years. Certainly, I've worked on the competence of professionals, certainly building engineers and health and safety professionals, but also recognizing that some of the really important work that's done by people on site, needs to be done well, but also they need the recognition and the acknowledgement for their own standards of competence. And we need to have proper systems in place to support that, but also that clients need to be intelligent customers. So that pressure will come where they will begin to ask questions of you to say, can you demonstrate your competence? So you need to be ready and prepared for that. And that's definitely going to ramp up a bit this year as we see more enforcement of the Building Safety Act. We see those prosecutions from Grenfell coming into play. Certainly the bar is going to be raised and everyone needs to come along, if you like, on that journey. So thank you very much for listening and your time. Hopefully you found that useful. And Sophie and I are very happy to do our best to answer any questions that you might have following what we've said.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean. I can see that there aren't any questions as yet in the Q&A box, but I also had a couple of messages from people to say that the Q&A box had actually disappeared from their screens. So there's a chat box which you can use as an alternative if you want to give us any feedback or raise a question. Or if you can't see that, then if you click on the box that says more and has 3 little dots in it, that has the Q&A box within it. So hope there's different routes to getting a question through to Sean and Sophie if you'd like to. And I also noticed from the numbers of attendees at the webinar that some people joined partway through. So if that's you and you missed some of the earlier part of Sean's presentation and Sophie's remarks as well, we will send you a follow-up email which will have the link to the recording so you can catch up on anything that you missed afterwards. But please do pop your questions in the box before we close the session. So I can see someone's just added to say thank you, but they need to leave now. So fair enough. Thank you for your time. Yes.
Could I please mention something? Because Sean said something earlier which prompted me to remind people that the ICC and the BSI are collaborating on a competence hub that has now officially launched yesterday, actually. So this work that we're doing here is likely to be published there alongside with other work of the ICC and more competence frameworks. So we are aware that there's a lot of fragmentation of information around. So it will be a good place where people can go to as a destination to find reputable information in that space around competence.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Sophie. We can share the link to that to the BSI hub in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say, actually, a lot of the conversations we're having, Sophie, are around providing sort of examples of best practice, case studies, trying to cover off as many different areas as we can. So, because I think one of the dangers with a focus on competence sometimes is there is a fixation around qualification, and qualification mechanisms as well, like the SSIP scheme. So although we know they're important and they do play an important part, I think it's really important for people to acknowledge the other aspects of competence from, experience, skills. Not every job requires a particular qualification, but it certainly requires people to be competent. And that can be demonstrated in different ways. So the bit that I always struggle a little bit with, and this comes from a bit of work I did. I worked in the area of ethics, certainly in my own profession, is those behaviors as well, is sort of identifying, it's almost like you know when there are poor behaviors. We all recognize it when people aren't behaving in the right way, and they're creating those toxic environments. But it can be a very difficult thing to assess, or determine ahead of time. So I think it's something that people exhibit as they do work, and those are the things just to keep on board. So I think in the examples we give, we want to give examples of what good looks like in terms of good behaviors, reporting things when they're not right, speaking up when you see things are wrong, that type of thing, and having the right sort of behaviors and ethical perspective, but also recognizing that the work you do into buildings can have an effect many years down the line. So that quality aspect of work, I think, is really important. That it's that legacy
Could I
stuff.
quickly add to that,
Yeah.
of course, the work that we're doing will be free. The document will be freely available because there's so many people that have come together from across the sector that it's important that this information becomes available free of cost. And of course, the ICC document will be freely available as well.
Yeah, and we will alert our members to that as well when it becomes available so that they can benefit from that. There's a few questions come in that are on a similar theme about how is people's competence going to be assessed, who's going to do that, and alternatively, how do you display and demonstrate competence apart from qualifications? So how can you verify your experience and behaviours? How can that all be proved and documented, I suppose, is the question.
Is that one for you, Sophie, or me?
Well, I think we both have got something to add to that.
Hmm.
Because this document, and no doubt you will pick up on this later on when you provide your answer, Sean, is it's not about the assessment piece in itself. Obviously, the key objective here is about managing the competence piece, the second part to it, so that people are actually competent on the project and you have sufficient competent people on the project. And then, of course, the validation piece will be important as well. But how that will be done, part of the work that will be going on after we've developed this guidance piece, which will be free, is that it will be developed into a standard. While the document at this point in time will give some measurable elements, the BSI standard will then be used as a competence standard that will outline how the assessment piece will take forward. And then it is up to any organisation that wants to support people within that to possibly provide the schemes to do that. And it will be important to make a distinction around pre-qualification standards and actual competence standards in that space. So, Sean, I have got some comments around the different elements around SCEB, but I
Yeah.
think I should hand over to you first.
Yeah, no. So I'm really glad someone's asked that question, because it's obvious that we might want to have a scheme to provide a framework for assessment. So that is a conversation that's been had. I mean, certain areas lend themselves to getting on with that pretty quickly, because they're professional areas and they maybe already have these systems in place. I think it is important, and in the document, actually, there are some sort of those diagnostic questionnaires, which are almost questions that you can use as a form of self-audit in a way. I don't like to use the word audit. Let's call it evaluation. So a self-evaluation, which you can sort of use it on reflection to say, are we doing the right things? Are we covering off the bases here? The next natural step from there is to create other schemes, if you like, through other organizations, which may then, be able to do more independent type evaluations on organizations to give clients assurance. So I think that is the next step, and that's definitely something we're moving on and towards this year.
Okay, thank you both. Thomas has asked an interesting question. He said he thinks that contractors, particularly the SMEs, are very keen to satisfy themselves that they're only undertaking work that they're competent to carry out, but need more guidance around how they practically do that. Is that something that the guidance that you've been working on will address when it's available?
Yeah, I think almost it's definitely what we want. It's an objective we have to achieve that. I mean, it's a bold objective actually because we there's a lot of very talented people on the steering group and working into the task and finish group, and I've had some excellent feedback through that. It's difficult to know every single situation that might come up, but I think the case studies and the sort of practical examples are there to try and capture as many different situations as possible, and to give people an idea of what it should look like in their own business, and definitely to make that scalable. So, I mean, my our business that I work for and run is an SME. It's pretty large. I mean, it's about 200 people strong, but nevertheless, we are an SME, and we have lots of accreditation certifications that we have to achieve as a business. So and we have lots of auditors coming around and auditing us. But so I'm very aware of the sort of bureaucratic drain that can put on a small organization. I feel that pain, if you like. But at the same time, it's really good to hear that organizations want to know where they are in terms of competence. And I guess as we move into the future, they will feel that downward pressure. So, I'm working with a couple of small businesses at the moment where they definitely are being asked to demonstrate competence by the clients, and that's coming down from quite a long way. So that could be it could be an investment fund that owns a building that's working into a managing agent, and they've asked the managing agent, and then the managing agent is asking them for more assurance across all their contractors and subcontractors that they're using. And in some cases, that's a bit of a surprise. They're like, well, I've never had to do this before, so why am I having to do it now? So it certainly puts businesses under a lot of pressure if they're not prepared. So I think one of the things we want to try and achieve with this is to help businesses be a bit more prepared and ready for that type of downward pressure, which we know is going to come. And it's definitely beginning to happen already. So, but we do it in a proportionate way. So I think the best thing, I always think, it's a bit like in business. If you make things too difficult, nobody even tries. So you've got to make things reasonable and achievable, and then at least you'll get people to make the effort and try. And that's where we want to. So we want to start in a reasonable place so that people feel that they can achieve these things, even if they're a small, busy business.
Yeah,
And I mean, most businesses want to do the right thing, but having run a small business myself, I know how difficult it can be
yeah.
to do everything you need to do.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So Spencer is asking about, um, is this going to be more like self-assessment rather than somebody else coming in and assessing what a business is doing, particularly for our members who are working for domestic clients. So there's less of that requirement from coming from the client to be able
Mm.
to demonstrate competence. And I think the answer I'm hearing from you, Sean, is yes for now, but that may change in the future. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, I think Sophie, you're quite tuned into this, aren't you, at the moment? So
Well, there's quite a lot happening, of
yeah,
course, in that space around the licensing of contractors, principal contractors, etc. So that's definitely a picture that's evolving. There's conversations taking place within MHCLG around how they can move that piece, how they can regulate professions, and amongst, well, they use the word professions, but they use the wider built environment and anyone who kind of works within that space. In terms of our guidance being self-assessment, I think just to bring back to what Sean was saying, you can definitely use it already to assess if you're doing the things that are expected to be doing, and therefore that will really help a long way towards working towards being prepared for external validation. But it's not because you're doing things externally that you have to prepare for that and really reflect internally as well that you're standing up for that. The external assessment piece comes on top of that. You
yeah.
first need to deliver against what you should be delivering.
Yeah, I think certainly governments and regulators are always a little bit nervous about creating an industry around things like this. So they know but at the same time, they want to raise standards. So there's a little bit of a little bit of decision making about what's proportionate, and it's a bit like the decision to move to a regulated profession. So we take fire risk assessors as an example. Um, there's several stages to that. Like the first stage could be defining mandatory qualifications and then having a competency assessment, if you like, layered on top of that. And then all of a sudden you create a register, it's looked after by an independent body, and that becomes a regulated profession. So you can move in those directions, but not all professions require that, because you need to be a little bit more flexible. Otherwise, you'd kind of almost design out capability within the industry. So we have to be very careful that we don't create an impossibility, if you like, and that nobody can achieve, and then we end up with nobody to get on and do the work. So it's balancing those two things up. I think the document itself is really set up nicely to give people that sort of self-evaluative tool, so that they can do it. And I think demonstrating that will almost become more sort of light regulation in a way, because stakeholders will be asking for that level of assurance, and then they'll be demanding that on everyone, right down to contractors who are working into buildings from small businesses. They still have to demonstrate it. What we're trying to do is to make sure that they don't get overwhelmed, and we don't make it impossible for them to achieve. So the guidance is important to achieve that, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the members has commented that they would actually like to have a framework that they can use to create a sort of document that talks about proof of competency to cover them for the work that they're undertaking. And I think that's something that we at the FMB would like to provide to members as well. We have already created a very basic document that sits alongside the FMB suite of contracts for domestic building work, that is a couple of pages to talk about, we believe we're competent to do this work that you've asked us to do because we've done these other similar projects in the past, and we've got this experience and competence within our workforce, and that kind of thing. So members might want to take a look at that, but that will obviously need to be developed so that it aligns with the guidance that we've been talking about as well.
And I would say that trade bodies, trade associations like FMB, do excellent work in this area, and they've got a really, really important role to play in this guidance. So not just contributing to it, but also building on it as well, literally building on it to help their members. And I think that's really good. So yeah, to me, that's like music to my ears. That's kind of exactly what we want to achieve through this piece of work, is to get that broadly disseminated, get to the hard to reach groups as well. So not everyone's working in a professional context with the body directly, but being represented by trade associations and having those tools available to them through that, I think, is just so valuable. Yeah.
If I could just reinforce that piece, ultimately the objective of us coming together is to provide that uniformity. We're absolutely working towards that in the long term, towards that framework that can be used as assessment and towards proof. And then, as Sean said, it is up to the individual organisations like FMB to contextualise that for their members so it's appropriate what will come out, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach in a way, but we need to work towards common principles, which is why we're collaborating, and the document will also provide that initial principle set and will be available to everyone.
Great, thank you. Have you got time for one last question? I'm conscious that it's almost 5 o'clock.
Oh yes, yeah. We can answer one more question.
So Charles has asked about, aside from hiring an FMB member, how would a domestic client assess the competence of the firm they want to hire to do, for example, a loft conversion? And how would the domestic client, even know that they needed to think about the competence of that business? I think that's a whole other piece of work, isn't it? But any thoughts on that?
Well, I can have a first stab at that, Sean. No doubt you've got more to add on that.
I'm glad you said that.
I think it is in part the reason why we started this work, because where do people start to find out this information when there is no common framework to begin with? So we're trying to bring this together to provide that certainty and then to provide that information, including to domestic clients, because how on earth would they begin to assess the competence of someone? It's going to be a tall order for anyone who's not got any experience in this place. And that's, of course, where the role of the validation piece comes in, and that Thomas already indicated that he would like to see something in place that they can use as proof of competence. And that should then help both drive the standards and make it easier for clients, domestic clients, to go to the right people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm a big advocate of sort of educating and informing as broadly as possible. So I think, helping educating everyone, actually, it's not just everyone should be involved in this, including members of the public. We already know, certainly in blocks of flats, for example, that we've had to work quite hard educating leaseholders and tenants about those blocks. There's clearly knowledge gaps there. So that's a really important piece. I mean, I don't have a clear answer for that, but it did make me smile the other day. I'm on a WhatsApp group, a street WhatsApp group. We're often asking for recommendations for people to do stuff. And the Federation of Master Builders was mentioned on my street WhatsApp group, which I thought was really
Excellent.
positive. Yeah, clearly people were saying, look, if you want to get a good job done, and start here because these are the good guys basically, and that they'll be, they'll give you better quality work and do it safer. So that did make me smile. I thought it was great, and it's nice to see that message is getting around. So social media and these groups can actually have a positive impact in helping people understand that competence does matter. And it's about safety, but it's also about quality.
Yeah.
So you want a job done well, get a competent person in to do it, and that will invariably mean it's going to be safer as well.
Yeah. Well, that's what we want to hear, Sean, that people are recommending the FMB
Yeah.
and its members. Perfect. One of the things we're working on as well is a document, a sort of flyer for members to give to their clients to explain a bit more about the Building Safety Act and their obligations under it, as well as the contractors' obligations. In fact, one of our members down in the southern region has already designed their own flyer, and we're sort of working to produce a generic one that would be suitable for all members to use, which will at least raise a bit of awareness, if they give that to clients with their quote, for example, or their contract, then it's just helping to get that message out there that it's not always wise to go for the cheapest quote, is it? You have to think
Well,
about the
exactly, yeah.
competence and the safety aspects as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, you end up paying twice, and then it's much more expensive. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we're drawing to a conclusion here. Most of the members have stayed with us right to the bitter end, so thank you for that. That's really great. And thank you so much, Sean and Sophie, for your input and for answering all of those questions as well. And I really feel like this is not the end of the discussion on these issues. It's more like the beginning, isn't it? So maybe you could come back sometime in March after the guidance has been published and
Yeah,
talk
I'd
to us
be
again.
delighted to. Yeah, thanks very much, Hayley. Thanks for the invite. It's been really great.
Thank you. Okay, we'll close it now then. Thank you very much and goodbye, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.